And he asked me what I do for a living, and I was a lawyer, but I didn't want to say that because in my experience, doctors both resent and feel superior to lawyers. So I said that I was a writer, which was sort of more aspirational than true at that point. I was writing a lot, but the things I was writing were terrible and nobody wanted to read them. I'd managed to get one book published, but it was terrible and nobody bought it. And I was secretly happy that nobody bought it because it was so terrible. Unless anybody here bought it, in which case, thank you. So I tell Dr. Agnew all this, and he says, you know, I'm also writing a book. And I said, really? And he reached behind into this cabinet, he takes out this kind of like prospectus-type document with a plastic cover and spiral binding. And on the cover is a picture of Dr. Agnew, and he's wearing a black cape, and he's pulling a rabbit out of a hat. And the cover says, Magic for Beginners by Wenga the Pretty Good. And he gave it to me, and I was looking at it, and I said, oh, is it about magic? And he said, yes, because I'm not just a physician. I'm also a magician. And I said, you're Wenga, and he goes, it's Agnew, spelled backward. And I said, what's with the pretty good part? And he said, well, I don't like to brag. And he said, it's just a side gig. And I'm like, that's probably the fiscally responsible choice. He said, I just love the back and forth, the interaction with the audience. That's where the whole act is set up. And then later on, you do your tricks, everybody's amazed. And I said, you know, I've heard that about magic. I dabble. And then I wasn't sure what else to say, so I said, can I keep this? And he said, well, that's my only copy. So I gave it back to him. We kind of sat there in silence for a second, and then he said, I guess we should do this exam. And I said, yeah, we probably should. And so, you know, he pokes and he prods, and he takes my blood pressure and all that, and he says, do you smoke? And I said, no. And he said, have you ever smoked? And I said, for like 2 weeks in college. He said, well, that counts. And he said, do you drink? And I'm like, you know. And he said, what do you drink? And I said, just beer. And he said, well, that counts too. And he said, and how old are you again? So I told him, and he said, you know, you're at the age where we really recommend that men start paying more attention to their prostate health. And I said, okay, how do I do that? And he said, well, you get a prostate exam. I said, okay. And he said, so do you want a prostate exam? And I said, sure, that's fine. Yeah, great. So he said, stand up and grab the counter and drop your shorts. And I said, am I supposed to have a chaperone? And he said, do you want a chaperone? And I said, no. So he does the exam, and it's uncomfortable, but it's fine. And as he's finishing up, he says, I take it that you've never had that procedure performed before. And I said, just once in a nightclub. And I don't know why I said that. I think I was just trying to take back some measure of control. But Dr. Agnew didn't laugh. And I said, I'm just kidding. And he goes, hey. And then he said, you know, you're all set. You know, if anything comes up, call my office. Otherwise, make an appointment to come back in a year. But before you go, do you want to see a magic trick I've been working on? And I felt like we had just been so intimate, it'd be rude to say no. So I said, sure. And he said, great. And he leaves the room, and he comes back a few minutes later, and he's got a black cape on, and he has like a felt-lined cup and a mirrored tray. And he says, hold out your hands, and I do that. And he dumps the cup into my hands and a couple playing dice. And he says, these are just regular dice, aren't they? Check them out. I'm like, this is not regular dice. And he says, put them back in the cup. So I do, and he takes the cup and he turns it over on the tray, and he starts moving it around, and he says, I bet if we really focus, we can make these dice disappear. And I said, okay. And he said, are you focused? And I said, yes. And he said, okay, abracadabra. And he picks the cup up, and the dice are gone. And I said, that's pretty good. As advertised. And he said, there's more. He said, I bet if we really, really focus, we can make these dice reappear. I said, okay. He said, are you focused? I said, yes. He said, are you really focused? And I said, yes, but I wasn't. Because at that point, I was trying to figure out when he set that trick up. because if it turned out he shoved those dice up my ass, I'd be outraged, obviously, but also a little impressed. And as I tried to reconcile these two competing reactions, he reached behind my ear and he said, "Oh, look, here they are. Thanks."
Well, that was a relief. All right. Next up, we have Janice Sorensen. Janice is an artist, writer, gardener, interior designer, and community activist living in Buckland, Mass, with a fluctuating number of pets, house guests, and family members.
I was not a great waitress. I did not have the nimble mind and body nor spirit of deceit that the other wait staff had. I didn't even have more than one of the polyester blend white short sleeve shirts with the Ann Sathers logo on it that we were mandated to purchase for $25, which back in 1988 was a lot of money. Ann Sather was the Swedish woman who had established the diner in Chicago where I worked. And oh boy, I just blanked. Along with it, she established a tradition of putting down 2 cinnamon rolls with every order. Whether you got the skirt steak with all the sides or merely a cup of coffee, you got 2 cinnamon rolls. And I blame those cinnamon rolls for the myriad reasons I ought to have been fired. But I was not until way later. I would find myself standing next to the tray of cinnamon rolls that were plated up, trying to remember what the woman at 6 West had ordered for her side dishes. And she had asked me about the croquettes, to which I'd said, I wouldn't eat them. Then she said, the meatloaf? And I said, better. And then she said, the lemon sole. And we had decided that that would go well with the zucchini mix and the rice and the applesauce. So I said, sold, to the woman in the celery green scarf. But while I'd been standing there, I had unconsciously been reaching down to decenter these cinnamon rolls and had eaten 3 at a time. So I ought, and I would just wipe my hands on my pants so they were covered with glaze. And at the end of the night, I would just go home and scrape it off with a knife. And I got 2 weeks out of those pants without ever washing them. And that one shirt I had, I hand washed sometimes. So I ought to have been fired for poor hygiene, but I wasn't. But there was the day that in the dining room upstairs where a customer had ripped open the egg on his Egg Benedict and declared it too runny. So I was heading down the stairwell and I was getting really anxious because I knew that the husband owner was going to somehow make this my fault and he was going to get furious. So I didn't have my cinnamon pacifiers to placate the nervous eater in me, so I reached for the next best thing, the Eggs Benedict. And I took a bite and then went and handed him the plate and was horrified when he simply took the egg off, put it on the grill, the obvious solution for a too runny egg. I thought he was gonna make a whole new one. But then he lined the bite in the egg that I'd taken with the bite in the English muffin that I'd taken, handed me the plate, and I actually turned for a second, realizing that the customer is going to totally know he hadn't bitten the English muffin. So I turn around, confess what I had done, and he loses his shit and shouts at the top of his lungs, "Get out of my sight!" So I leave, and wishing it was forever, but it was only meant for that day. But then there was the strange protocol that we had of every single night we would take the leftover cinnamon rolls, bag them up, and the next morning throw them away because they were day old. Every night, every morning. So I saw the wife owner and said, "Hey, can I take these to the soup kitchen down the street?" And she was distracted, said yes. So I started doing that every night. Well, one night in the stairwell, she sees the bag and she says, "What's this bag all about?" And I said, "But you remember when you said," and she looked at me and she said, "That was Thursday. This is today. You can't make me give," which is an astounding statement, but I wasn't fired for that. I got fired when she walked through the door. She was a customer with day-glow orange-red hair. It was stunning. It was like a lava lamp. It was spiky, and she was walking toward me. She's 10 feet away, and I remember my friend Sin's poem that she'd won the Green Street Poetry Slam with 3 weeks in a row, entitled "My Hair's on Fire." And this woman's walking toward me, 10 feet away. I hear in my head, "My hair's on fire." Then it transmutes into "Your hair's on fire," 8 feet away, 5 feet away, "Your hair's on fire, your hair's on fire," till she's right next to me, and I jut my head to the side and utter the 4 words that did finally get me fired.
After all that other stuff you did, I can't believe that's the thing, but okay. All right, our third storyteller in this half is Brian Tawney. Brian is a high school English teacher and baseball coach from Simsbury, Connecticut, and is originally from Shelburne Falls.
So I was about 4 years old, and my father took me with him to visit his friend Fritzy Graves, who lived on the edge of town in a mobile home that had a little makeshift porch out by his front door, where he and Dad grabbed a few drinks, maybe a few too many drinks, and set up camp with a few folding chairs and left me to my own devices, which was fine with me because Fritzy's yard had a ton of distractions in it. There were rusted out chassis everywhere, including this cool-looking pickup truck on blocks right by his house. He also had a ton of animals like chickens and barn cats, and there was this nervous dog that I kept trying to pet. Fritzy also had a satanic goat, which I didn't see right away because I was so obsessed with this snarling dog, which, I approached cautiously with my hand held out. And then out of nowhere, I feel this dull thud in my lower back. I turn and I see that this evil, cowardly goat has headbutted me from behind for no good reason. I didn't know what to do. I looked to the porch for help. I thought maybe Fritzy had some sort of special command to give the beast that would help me out, but no dice. He and Dad just laughed, opened another bottle, and said that I should watch out. Before I realized what happened, the goat headbutted me again, this time right in the chest. So that was enough for me. I took off screaming bloody murder, dashing around sedans and riding mowers, this crazy goat chasing me all across Fritzy's yard. I finally saved myself by climbing up onto the hood of the truck on blocks, but not before I felt another sharper pain lower in my body. I turned and saw a goat mouth-shaped hole in my pants pocket. The damn thing had bitten me in the ass. It hadn't broken the skin or anything, but this goat acted like it had a taste for blood. It bleated maniacally and scrabbled at the grill of the truck like it was trying to get purchased to come in for seconds or something. I'm crying in terror and rubbing my bottom, and I looked again to Fritzy's porch. He and Dad are doubled over in laughter. I am on my own. So I guess at this point I must have kind of blacked out or repressed the trauma of the ensuing goat siege at Rusted Truck, because this evil creature kept me up there for a while, but I'm not exactly sure how long or how I got down from there. I mean, obviously I did because, I stand here before you physically whole, if a little emotionally scarred. Everything turned out all right in the end. Dad eventually got sober and took better care of me, and I was never again assaulted by any barnyard animals. However, the trauma of the goat attack did follow me into adult life at least once. About 25 years later, my wife and I are at a little amusement park with our oldest daughter, who's about 2. This is all on video and can be confirmed. There we stood in the wildlife park, surrounded by chicks and ducks and sheep and other furry creatures, and of course, there were also goats. I tried so hard to repress my trauma and ignore the goats and focus on helping my daughter dole out those little feed pellets and keeping her safe and doing all the things Dad hadn't been able to do for me at a similar age. Then it hit me, literally. One of the goats smacked me in the leg, not once, but several times. I'm sure it just wanted its share of the feed pellets, but as you can imagine, I was incapable of sympathizing. After about the 3rd or 4th headbutt, I guess I kind of snapped, and with my free hand, I chopped down and back and landed a solid blow in the side of its head. And at the same time, I cried out far too loudly, "Back off, bitch!" The film gets really shaky at this point due to our videographer's laughter, but you can still see the confusion and disappointment in everyone's faces. My wife's, my in-laws, other more emotionally stable young parents, they didn't know quite what to make of my behavior. I mean, I knew I had messed up. I was a fully grown man surrounded by small children and baby animals, and I had just assaulted and cursed at a goat. I wanted to explain to everyone about Fritzy's demon animal and my bruised 4-year-old backside and the besiegement on the rusty truck, but I realized getting bitten in the ass by a riled up billy goat while your alcoholic father and his drunk friend laugh at you is a memory that stays with you forever, but it's not the kind of story you can just blurt out at the petting zoo.
Okay. All right. Next up, we have Tim Gillis. Tim is a writer and illustrator who has shared his stories online, on stage, and on TV. He loves telling a story, then having others add their story to it, making it more complete, taking a story of one and building it into the story of many. Tim.
So I'm standing 3 feet from third base, and I'm watching the foul ball go over my new teammates' heads. When I do the worst thing that any 11-year-old boy in the history of 11-year-old boys has ever done, I pee in my pants. And I'm the new kid here, just moved up from Downingtown, Pennsylvania to Wilbraham, Massachusetts. And being a new kid is not easy. I left a home in a town that I loved, where everyone knew my name and I knew theirs. I even knew their nicknames. Like when the kids were talking about egg on toast, I knew they were talking about my buddy, Richard Egon. And I could find my way home from anywhere back there, any trail I was riding my bike on, my buddies' houses. Now, I don't even know where my home is. All because my dad got a promotion. And now I am the new kid in a new town, learning hard lessons the hard way. Here's a lesson I learned fast. In Wilbraham, Massachusetts, boys only wear cut-off shorts when they go to a pool party. About 3 weeks after getting here, I get invited to a 5th grade pool party. I show up, and within a minute, Beth Donnelly is pointing towards me, and a wave of laughter tsunamis through the pool. Because all the boys are wearing cut-off shorts, and I am proudly sporting my Speedo. Because that's what kids wore. You can have friends or you can have a hot pink Speedo, but you cannot have both. I learned that if you ask for a hoagie, you get laughed at. But if you ask for a grinder, you get fed. I learned that dads change. Mine certainly did. After a couple of weeks, he would come home from work. He wouldn't talk to me. He would just walk into the house and stare at me as I was playing with the neighborhood kids. Maybe he was confused because I wasn't playing with egg on toast. Or maybe he was missing his friends too. So Mom signs me up for baseball, which brings me to here, 3 feet from third base. It's my first game. I'm wearing my brand new uniform. I've never had a uniform before. Flannel pants, flannel shirt. Next to me is Matt, the bully Brown. He's playing third base. He's staring at me with his beady bully eyes. I do not know this kid, but I heard him being whispered about my teammates. And up to bat is Dan Matthews. And Dan swings and fouls the ball off. Well, this is the ball that I'm staring at. And behind me is Coach Brown. And he's saying, tag up, tag up, tag up. But I don't tag up because I know the ball is not going to be caught. Instead, I stand and I watch it go over my teammates' heads. John Devine, Chuck Stark, Dan Murphy, or Johnny and Chucky and Murph if you're their friends, but I haven't earned that right yet. They don't even know my name. They just call me hey or what's up. And then it happens. Coach Brown grabs me by the back and he pulls me backwards and he says, when I say tag up, I mean tag up. And then I'm so startled, I pee in my pants. And I'm not talking about a trickle here. I am talking about the flood of the Euphrates. Noah's fucking ark. 40 days and 40 nights. This is biblical, and there's no place for me to hide. It is just me and the stains that shame me. Me, the kid in search of home. Me, the kid with the pink Speedo. Me with the dad standing over there alone watching. And somehow, no one notices this stain. And with the next pitch, it goes way over the catcher's head. It rolls all the way to the backstop. And I can walk home if I want to. But I want to run. And I run from the bully, and I run from Coach Brown, and I run from the Speedo, and I run from being unknown and unnamed and nervous. I run like a fucking rocket, and I slide into home bait, and I put all the dirt I can, and finally, I stand up, and I face whatever is coming my way. And there, with their arms extended because we just won the game, is Johnny and Chucky and Murph. And they're calling my name. And I think that maybe I have found my way safely home.
All right, thank you. All right, our last storyteller of the evening is Rachel Leventhal Weiner. Rachel is a mom, partner, researcher, home cook, and triathlete who loves time with her family, being outside, data charts, and telling stories. Rachel.
Before my daughter's second summer at overnight camp, I figure it's time to get on record with her about the birds and the bees. And I'm not going to call it the birds and the bees because we use real words in our house for all of your genitalia and actions. But I hadn't really broached this with her. We talked about periods, so we'd really, we talked a little bit about her changing body. But she's 10 going on 16, and even though she thinks she's really mature, she's still pretty youthful, pretty green, but she's going off to camp with a number of friends that have older siblings. And as parents, you're doing a perfect job until other kids come into the picture. So I just wanted to get on record. And I knew that a talk about sex wasn't like a one and done situation like many sexual encounters might be, but I just figured, we had to start talking about this. So one night I sent my husband out of the house with our youngest, and I said, come here, we'll snuggle up, and before I fold some laundry and settle with Netflix, let's talk about sex. And so we did that. We sat down, and I had no way to figure out how to get into the conversation. So I just started awkwardly, a little slow, saying, remember we talked about periods, and remember how that felt, your changing body? And she was like, yeah. And I was like, well, yeah, I don't know if you know anything about this thing called sex, and I don't mean to talk about it health class, or I'm just feeling things out, just settling into the mood. And she says, yeah, I know all about sex. And I said, what do you know? And she said, oh yeah, Jossie told me all about it. And I'm like, Jossie, our quiet neighbor from across the street, Jossie, who you can barely hear the words she says. And she's like, yeah, Jossie said, it's when the penis goes in the vagina. And I was like, that's a starting point, For some people, that's the ending point. But, I figured, well, this is good. Okay, so I'm settling into them, locking into this conversation. I was like, great, well, but then all of my knowledge of human biology just leaks out of my ears. I'm thinking to myself, well, honey, the penis goes in the vagina, and the penis has sperm, and the vagina is attached to the cervix, which is attached to the uterus, and that's where eggs go. And then I realized, I lock into the conversation. First it was out of body, and then I was really there, and I was like, am I really telling my 10-year-old about getting pregnant? Because that's really what sex could lead to. And and I was like, I guess I am. So let's just, keep going, get it over with. And we start rushing through the conversation. And I was like, so, there's the egg and the sperm, and they get together, and that makes a baby. But if you get your period, there's no baby. Ta-da! And we got to the end of the conversation. And, I'm rushing to the very end of it, kind of the very end of sex. And I was like, I don't know. She's yesing me, and, I think she's hearing me. We're kind of laughing because we're talking about penises and vaginas. And, conversation over. I'm like, great, one and done for now. And she leaves the room and comes back, and then she says, wait a second. So you're telling me that anybody who's ever had a baby has had sex? And I was like, well, honey, as a parent, you should stop before you say any words and answer the question they asked. So I said, love makes a family, honey. We know lots of families that have lots of different kinds of arrangements that come into being in lots of ways. But for the purposes of tonight, yes, everyone who's ever had a baby has had sex. And I should have just left it right there. But what I did was I just kept going. And so, like many encounters, you should have just called it off. But I kept going, and I said, but if you didn't want to have a baby, there's a thing a man can put on their penis, it's called a condom, and then, or mommy takes birth control pills, and that means there's no egg, and that's just something you can do. And then she goes, wait a second. You're telling I had not anticipated. I was hoping that was going to be far, far down the road, but here we are. We're doing this right now. And then it's like not just one question quietly uttered. It's like, wait a minute. Well, where and how and when and how often? And I was like, these are too many. You don't need to know my answers. I mean, my answers are sort of like sometimes, and like mostly in bed because we're the same height, and it's like really awkward otherwise, and like not on mommy's birthday, typically, maybe Valentine's Day. So but then I'm thinking to myself, none of this is any of her business, and she actually hasn't made the connection that this is something that her father and mother do. And so I'm feeling really in the clear. I've given her some answers, and then at some point, a different light bulb goes off for her. And she says, wait a second, what about 2 dad families? And I say to myself, as I'm nearing the exit, honey, I think that's another conversation for another night. Thank you.
All right, those were our 10 storytellers. Give them all a hand again. It takes a lot of guts to get up here, even if you're not telling a cringe story, but it takes way more guts if you are. So thank you. All right, so the time has come to put in our votes.